All right, now we're going to talk about the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, 2 for 1.
Both in one video.
Yep.
Nice.
Yep. And some of the others, we've split up the 2 books. In this book, it's just such a seamless transition between the 2. We'll hit them both in this video.
Okay.
The book of Kings, it actually originally was one book. It covers the history of Israel from about 970 BC to 586 BC. That's from King Solomon. It starts with Solomon, David's son, and ends with Judah being destroyed and carried off to Babylon in exile. So this is kind of the end of Israel's story pre-exile, as it was, all of it's been culminating to David and Solomon and this kingdom, and now the downfall of Israel throughout this whole book. And this is a book similar to Samuel, where do you like, political intrigue, coups, assassinations, battles,
good point.
like one family taking out the other family? I mean, this could easily be a show, movie. I mean, This is like exciting stuff, terrible stuff, but thrilling events that are happening all throughout this book, kind of at rapid pace. A lot goes on in these 2 books here. So here's the thesis that I came up with for the Book of Kings. God is in control of history and will eventually put his king on the throne, no matter how disobedient his people become.
Mm-hmm.
The Book of Kings ends despite utter failure and disobedience, despite Judah being carried off in exile. It ends with a glimmer of hope that David's line is still there. And you have to keep reading on to find out what happens to them. Okay, here are some of the key themes in the Book of Kings. The first one that's big throughout the whole book is worship. Specifically, who, where, and how you're supposed to be worshiping.
Mm-hmm.
It starts out with the temple, Solomon building the temple, and it's kind of this culmination of everything that's come before. God is in the midst of his people. Now he has a house. David wanted to build God a house in the middle of the people. Now he has a physical building. God is in the midst of his people, and that is the correct place to worship him. And then basically it goes downhill from there, and as you see the rest of the kings throughout the book, you see them failing to worship God in the right place. They set up their own altars, their own high places, and also, more importantly, probably failing to worship God at all, or at least only God. And many of the kings of Israel and Judah introduce, pagan worship into Israel. It's kind of this back and forth thing where some kings get rid of it, some kings bring it back, but constantly Israel is worshiping other gods besides the one true God.
Yep.
So this is a key theme throughout the book, and related to that theme is the theme that God is the only true God. That is, the book goes out of its way to make that completely obvious. God is the only true living God. It does this in a couple ways. Besides, so the kings that worship other gods get punished. The book shows how the other gods are just man-made creations. Maybe one of the most famous stories from the book is this battle between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, where it's proven beyond a doubt Baal does not exist. He's a man-made creation. Elijah's taunting them. The God of Israel is real, and he rains fire on the altar, destroys the prophets of Baal. So over and over and over again, the book goes out of its way to say God is the only one. He's the only true God, and you should be worshiping him and no one else.
Yeah.
Another key theme throughout the book of Kings, as you might expect, is this theme of the promise to David that he would have a king on the throne. This comes up over and over and over again as we see the kings that come after David and his line. And what you notice is that God remains faithful to his promise to David despite terrible, terrible kings that follow in David's line. And the reason why God doesn't destroy and put a new family into power like he did with Saul, he got rid of Saul and put David in because Saul disobeyed. David's descendants disobey, and over the book says, but I'm not going to take you off the throne because I promised to David. And David is kind of the measuring stick of whether this person's a good king or not. This person was like their father David, or they were not like David. And so there's this theme of God, even though David's descendants keep messing up, God is faithful to them, even to that last glimmer of hope at the end of the book where we see in Babylon, one of David's descendants kind of gets released from prison, and he's under the care of the king in Babylon, and that's how the
Right.
book ends.
Yep.
And then finally, another theme you see in this book is just what happens when you take the right path versus the wrong path. What happens when you do follow God, and what happens when you don't? What happens when you take the wise path, and what happens when you take the foolish path? And again, it couldn't be more obvious as you read this book, which one you're supposed to be taking and what the results of foolishness are, especially in the northern kingdom of Israel. There is just so much folly, so much evil, and it's the most messy, horrible kingdom you can imagine. There's so many different changes of power, assassinations, whole families being murdered. And why? It's because they're not worshiping God, they're not following God, they're making foolish decisions, they're following false gods, and that is the result when you make the wrong choices like that. So here's some tips on reading the Book of Kings. First of all, at the beginning of the book, as you're reading about Solomon for the first several chapters of 1 Kings, go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 17 as you're reading about Solomon, and kind of grade King Solomon and see how he does based on the rules for kings in Deuteronomy 17. Because in some ways, Solomon's a good king. It's really under Solomon that Israel's at its greatest extent, it's most united. He builds the temple. There's a lot of good things about Solomon. He asked for wisdom. Wisely, he asked for wisdom. But you might notice if you grade him on Deuteronomy 17 that there's a lot of things he doesn't get right. So go back and check Deuteronomy 17, read about Solomon, and see how he compares to that.
That's good.
After Solomon, Israel splits in half because of the foolishness of Solomon's son. And this is one of the hardest parts about reading the Book of Kings and everything that comes after Kings, is keeping track of who's being talked about here. Because the northern 10 tribes that split off are called Israel.
Right.
And then the southern tribes that stay are called Judah. And so in order to understand what's happening in Kings, you really have to keep track of, when it says Israel, usually that means the northern kingdom, but just make sure that's talking about the northern kingdom, 10 tribes. They have a whole different king. It's a whole different thing going on up there. Then Judah is referring to the kings in David's line.
Right.
And if you don't keep track of that, you're going to be very confused. There's multiple kings going on. It'll be really confusing. So one thing you could do, of course, you could look this up on your own, but it's helpful if you write it down, is just write down the kings of each one. Keep a list of who's who. Because sometimes they'll come back, sometimes they work together, sometimes they fight each other, the two kingdoms. It's really messy, and it gets confusing. Just keep a list of which king belongs to which nation, and they're really two whole separate nations at this point. And that's key to actually following along in the book, is keeping track of those two.
Nice.
Now that another thing you can do is you go through the book, keep track. Again, you can look this up, but it's fun to do it on your own. Keep a note of which kings are good and which kings are bad. A lot of what the book is concerned about is telling you this king did good, he was like David, or he was not like David. Or in the north, this king did bad, just like his father before him did bad.
And one of those lists is really short.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah, if you don't know already, when you go through and keep track of the lists, there's one of the kingdoms doesn't do so great.
Yeah.
So yeah, just keep track of which ones are good and which ones are bad. And again, that'll just help you track with what's going on in the story. That'll help you remember all of these names, what's going on. And it's just fun to see, or maybe sad to see, the results of that as you go through.
Right. Yep.
And then finally, one last tip. As you're reading through this book, there's a lot of prophets that show up. Famously, Elijah and Elisha are the two biggest ones. This is where we read about all of their amazing feats that they do, which is a lot fun to read about and incredible. But as you're going to go through, you're going to see other prophets that you've maybe even heard of before. Isaiah makes an appearance. Jonah makes an appearance. Try to, as you read a story, go then read that prophetic book that relates to that king.
That prophet.
Yes, that prophet.
Yep.
If a prophet shows up in the story, go read that prophet's book and see how he's talking to that king. The other thing you can do is go look, if you go through, for example, the minor prophets, most of the time in the first line of the book it says, this guy was a prophet during the reigns of this king, and this king.
Yep.
So when you get to those kings in the book of Kings, read about what that king did, read what that prophet had to say about that king's reign.
Yeah. Then you're getting the context of
Yes.
that minor
Really,
prophet.
that's a tip for reading the prophets. I mean,
Sure.
it
goes
both ways.
Yeah.
That'll really help you reading the prophets, and it'll help you. Sometimes Kings is brief. This king was bad, and it moves on.
Yep.
Then you can go read a prophet and go, oh, it was really bad.
Yeah.
It gives you
Yeah.
extra details on what's happening during that king's reign. Okay, Christ's connections, ties to Christ in the book of Kings. The biggest one is that Jesus Christ is king.
Yeah.
None of these kings in this book live up to their father David, and even David himself never lived up to the true need that we have for a king. And Jesus Christ is the true king of the universe. He is the only perfect, wise, completely good king who never makes a mistake, who never stumbles, and he is the fulfillment of all of this book. Every time, every new king that pops up, you're going, is this going to be the king that's promised? We're promised a king that's going to sit on David's throne, who's going to make everything right, who's going to reign forever. Which one of these kings is it? Because they're all terrible.
Yeah.
Even the good ones have their own mistakes, their own moments. Jesus Christ is the only perfect king, and he is the fulfillment of all of the hopes of the book of 1 Kings. That's the main way that Christ connects into this book.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, some takeaways for application for our lives from the book of Kings. This comes up in a lot of our Old Testament videos, in these videos, but it's just obvious in this book that there are two ways to live. Worship the true God, and it will go well with you.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worship him, and it goes poorly with you. I mean, maybe it's the most clear in this book yet out of any of them, as you just see the destruction that comes to these kings that don't follow God, and then the blessing that comes when a king does follow God. It's just obvious in this book. So that's, again, something we should be watching out for, looking at our lives, making sure that we are striving to follow God. And then finally, another takeaway is where and how we worship God matters, and we should take worship very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
There is only one true God, and we need to make sure that we are worshiping him and nothing else. And it's maybe less obvious for us than it was for them. You know, we're not setting up Baal statues and Asherah poles and all this stuff, but examine your life and make sure that you're actually only worshiping the true God and not worshiping other things, because that will lead to destruction. Yeah, that's the book of Kings.
Especially that reminds me of how some kings were mostly good, but they didn't finish the job, or they didn't go all the way, and a lot of that had to do with idolatry too, just kind of smashing everything and just making sure that we're clear of it.
Right.
And there's this sense of you could be on the right path, but lazy or something, maybe spiritually lazy, and that's not best either. We need to be zealous to take worship seriously, as you said.
Yeah.
What a great encouragement.
Yeah. Amen.
Thanks.